Oh yeah. Hey yo, it's the Russo Show. Hey yo, it's the Russo Show.
All right, everyone, welcome to episode 4 of Pizza Film School. I think we're peaking on episode 4 with the movie and with our guest. We're talking about The Empire Strikes Back. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our special guests this week. In addition to Markus and McFeely, who are back with us, we have the incredible Mark Hamill here with us on Pizza Film School.
Not to be confused with the Incredible Hulk.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this, Mark. This is amazing. Pizza Film School is based on movies that inspired my brother and I to become filmmakers. And in fact, in this particular case, Empire Strikes Back is not only one of the most important movies of our formative years, but was so important to the four of us, me, Anth, Chris, and Steve, is that it actually influenced the structure of a movie we made together called Avengers Infinity War, and led to a very prominent sort of downbeat or cliffhanger ending, very well-known cliffhanger ending from that movie. It truly owes its debt to Empire Strikes Back. And then before we jump into it, we love to do a shout out to all of our local restaurants. I got my pizza from Superfine, which we had mentioned in a previous episode, is owned by a very good friend of ours named Steve Sampson. Some of our favorite pizza that we can think of. So I'm very excited to have Superfine. Everyone else, you want to talk about where you got your pizza from?
I got my pizza from Roberta's in Culver City. Not only did they give us 3 pizzas, but they also gave us a free pizza that they call the Millennium Falco.
Ooh.
Yeah. So everybody has some sort of Star Wars connection. I'm convinced of it.
No one's delivering where I am, so this was an old pizza crust that we had cooked frozen, which now has some stuff on it. Pretending it's pizza.
Gino's East, which is a Chicago landmark, has opened a branch out in Sherman Oaks. I am excited to be eating deep dish pizza once again.
I had my pizza when I was rewatching Empire Strikes Back. As I've mentioned, I like to eat vegan. One of the things I love about what's happened in the past decade or so is this massive proliferation of pizzerias working in the Neapolitan style. A lot of these pizzerias will offer a marinara pizza, which is simply sauce in the dough. One of my favorite marinaras is made by John and Vinny's in Los Angeles. I would highly endorse that.
So, Mark, the whole idea behind Pizza Film School is to provide an opportunity for people to watch us talk about movies and hopefully educate while they're quarantined. And as I mentioned, this is a seminal film for many reasons. And I thought we'd start off by just talking about structure and the way that, we work as a group. So Anth and I direct, Markus and McFeely write, and together we spend many, many hours, months, and years in a room together talking about story structure as we break our films. Captain America, Winter Soldier, Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and now working together at our studio AGBO. And the way that we traditionally break down structure for everyone out there is, if you're interested in writing a screenplay, you can pick up these books. Sid Field, Robert McKee, if Joe Campbell, which was a huge influence on George Lucas for the Star Wars films. Our structure is really specific. The first act introduces status quo for the character. There is a page 10 inciting incident, which is starting to move the character away from the status quo. There's traditionally a page 17 moment where the character conflict becomes clear to the audience, and traditionally there's an obstacle that starts to move the character out of the status quo. There's an act 1 break where the character leaves the status quo officially and starts heading on a journey. That would be where the knight leaves the castle and heads out to slay the dragon. We tend to break up Act 2 into 4 quadrants because Act 2 is traditionally the longest act of any film and the hardest act. So what we do is we break it into 4 quadrants so it's more manageable in bite-sized bits. We break Act 2 up around a midpoint, which is traditionally a moment that points the hero towards the major conflict with the villain at the end of the movie, or at the climax. And then each of those quadrants traditionally has an obstacle. Quadrant 1, Quadrant 2, Quadrant 3 traditionally have obstacles that educate the hero. Quadrant 4 is usually the lowest moment. It's when the hero suffers a great loss that they then have to recover from to head into the final conflict in Act 3. So that is the structure that we follow every time that we break a film, and we can apply that to Empire Strikes Back as an instructional exercise because your character basically hits all of those beats. There's Luke's story, and then there's the story with Han and Leia. Two parallel stories going on. And Luke's story is the A story, and the Han and Leia is the B story. They cluster in the moments where they hit those traditional script mile markers. Everything is built around Luke, and the inciting incident of this film is when you're laying in the snow.
Luke. Luke.
And you see Obi-Wan, and he tells you to go to the Dagobah system.
Ben? You will go to the Dagobah system.
Dagobah system.
There you will learn from Yoda, the Jedi Master who instructed me.
And that is the thing that activates Luke in the story. Will you talk to us a little bit about your process of working with George and Irvin Kershner, who directed this film, in terms of understanding the storytelling in Empire Strikes Back? Were there very early conversations before there was a script, or did you start conversations after there was a script?
Well, to put it in context, when I got the part of Luke, it was based on a screen test, 10, 12 pages. I didn't read the script to the movie until I'd been selected. And they said, you got the part, we're going to send the script over. And when I read it, I was stunned. I mean, I was really trying to figure out the style of film. Is this a parody? Is it, I mean, I remember at the screen test asking Harrison, I said, you know, George, you worked with him in American Graffiti. Is this sincere, or is it like Mel Brooks? Or, I mean, not that extreme, but is it sort of a send up? And he's like, hey, let's just do it, you know, come on. So he was no help whatsoever. And same with George. I was saying to George, is Luke someone who he's sincere, right? I mean, is he skeptical of this space pirate? And George was like, well, let's just do it and we'll talk about it later, which I learned because he would say that all the time. I knew that meant let's just do it and we'll never talk about it later. It made him, physically, you could see his skin crawling when you use words like backstory, motivation. He didn't want to hear any of that. I mean, he casts where you're so close to what he wants, he doesn't have to go in and do major overhauls of your process. I only told you that story because I'm telling you how lucky I was, because I had no idea what the film was like or what it was supposed to be. Now, when I read it, I thought, this isn't science fiction. This is a fairy tale. You've got a farm boy, you've got a pirate, you've got a princess, you've got a wizard. If we were traveling around in horse-drawn carriages, it would be very clear to the audience. And it had humor like I'd never seen in science fiction. 2001 is a classic, but a laugh riot it ain't. Most science fiction is very dry and antiseptic in a way. So I was just thrilled. I thought, my gosh, with the princess, there's effortless feminism.
This is some rescue. You came in here, didn't you have a plan for getting out?
Eat the brains, sweetheart.
Call this a plan? Give me that gun.
What the hell are you doing?
Somebody has to save our skins.
You know, she was hardly a damsel in distress. And the banter between the characters on the Death Star was very idiosyncratic and very modern. I know Gloria and Willard Hike did a pass on it, and they did work on American Graffiti uncredited. I think Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood, who I worked with on Corvette Summer, also took a pass at it. I mean, a lot of people had input, even though they're not all credited. Now, to flash forward to Empire Strikes Back, I was doing the Sam Fuller film, Big Red One, and when I got home from that, there was the script waiting for me. So there was not any prep. I didn't have a long telephone conversation with anybody, but everything had changed. Now, in the original film, when I read it, I thought, this is the goofiest thing I've ever read. I'm going to ask my friend Jonathan, who works at the LA Art Museum, to read it, to give me some feedback. He picked it up, he read it, we had a phone conversation. He said, you're right, this is the goofiest thing I've ever, I don't know how he's going to pull this off or how it's going to be received, because even though it was an amalgamation of so many different film styles, from Westerns, World War II movies, everything old is new again, but it was put together in a way that made it seem unique, especially in the time it came out, because this was a time when anti-heroes were very big. It's the returning embittered Vietnam veteran who comes back, a Rambo sort of. The only reason George had to make it a fantasy was because To present good guys and bad guys in such stark contrast would have been considered, I guess, old-fashioned or corny.
Yeah.
Jonathan called me up. He said, yeah, I can't make out how they're going to do this. He said, can I give it to Meredith? I said, sure. I passed it all around. At least 10 of my friends read it. Now,
Excuse me, Mark, are you talking about the Star Wars script or the Empire Strikes Back script?
No, this was Star Wars. The only reason I set this up is because now everything had changed.
Mm-hmm.
Now there was great security. There was pre-internet, but it was one of those things where we knew when I read Empire Strikes Back that I couldn't give it to my best friend or anybody. They didn't tell me not to pass Star Wars around. Nobody cared. But now everybody cared. As much as I was, as the British say, gobsmacked by reading Star Wars, nothing could have prepared me for reading Empire Strikes Back. Because to my way of thinking, the sequel is going to be, usually it's an attempt to sort of duplicate the feeling of the first film. And Star Wars was very much of a film where you, compared to an amusement park ride, where you buckle up and you just sit back and you take it in and you enjoy it. It's got that specific visual climax when the proton torpedo goes into the right spot. Visually, you can't really top that. I figured it'll be the same feel-good, funny, jokey movie that has a exhilarating, euphoric ending.
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
You know, and then we'll do a third one where you do the same thing. And what I'm saying was I was set up in the wrong way because when I read it, it was darker, it was more cerebral, it was so much more challenging for the audience. The first one, the audience didn't really have to contribute anything but their rear end in a seat. This one demanded so much more. It was more spiritual, it was deeper. I couldn't believe the character of Yoda.
I feel like
what?
like we're being watched.
Again, I was saying, I don't know how they're going to do this. The conversations I had with George at that time, he said, well, we were going to try a monkey in a mask and a little person in, for the more detailed stuff. But eventually, as you know, they came up with Stuart Freeborn designing this mechanical puppet that Frank Oz brought to life.
Yoda. You seek Yoda.
You know him?
Take it to him, alien.
What was interesting about Empire to me was overall the trilogy is a 3-act entity. So as Act 1 is Star Wars, Act 2 is Empire, Act 3 is Jedi. Now, within each movie, you have the 3-act structure. What I was unprepared for was Act 3. First of all, I knew nothing about my lineage being revealed.
Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father.
He told me enough.
We were all just absolutely defeated.
He told me you killed him.
No, I am your father.
I thought that's really risky. And I was really excited because so many of the movies I've loved growing up, you look back and you say, oh, Ace in the Hole was a flop when it came out? No, I didn't know that. A lot of the movies we really love, you'd find out, were not, I mean, It's a Wonderful Life, big flop. And I don't care about that. To me, I want a really good movie. So I wasn't worried about matching the success of the first one or any of that. But I was just thrilled that they were so daring that they would take a chance like that. Now, I sort of was misled in a way because what I thought when I read the script and saw what Luke went through was that he was being tested in the very same way his father had been, that the dark side was an easier way to go. And I was figuring that by the time the movie ended, I have one mechanical hand. That's sort of analogous to Vader. I thought the third film would be Luke turning to the dark side and then at the end having to redeem himself. I remember saying to George, I was a little disappointed in the script for Jedi. What he did was he reminded me, he says, Mark, these movies were meant for kids, and fairy tales always are. So he had to remind me what the original intent was, and I agreed with him. But, I mean, as an actor, you always want to play your evil twin. Or
Who was the first person you spoke to after you read that script for Empire Strikes Back, and what did you talk about? What was your reaction?
Yeah, my best friend, Jonathan Benair, the one who worked at the LA Art Museum. And I said, I can't let you read it now. Everything's changed now. There was scrutiny on us like we'd never ever had before. But he said, what did you think? And I was basically telling him, it's nothing like you would expect. It's darker, it's more spiritual. I mean, I could confide in him. And I said to him, this conversation is between you and I. You can't tell Meredith, you can't tell all those people that we shared the script with the first time around.
And by the time it got to you, was that already the Kasdan draft of it?
It must have been. They didn't involve us until we were necessary. You know, they don't want a lot of our advice. I mean, like I say, I have so many ideas and I'm more than willing to share them, even terrible ideas. You know, everybody's working in the same way. I mean, we're all share the idea that we want to make the best possible movie we can. I mean, they were open to listening to what you would say, and sometimes it did influence them a bit. I remember Harrison saying to me, because he came up with some just great ad libs. There's only one cockpit. He's up on a rostrum, and I'm sitting behind the rostrum in a folding chair, waiting for my turn, giving him off-camera lines. So, I got him. He goes, great kid. Then he added,
Don't get cocky.
I thought, are you kidding me? I just loved it. I admired him so much with that. And he said, well, you should learn, Mark. He said, don't go ask George, hey, George, can I say this? Just do it on camera. that was his technique.
He also, he ad-libbed I Know, didn't he?
I love you.
I know.
Yeah, they couldn't find the ending to that. I can't remember what the original line was, but that was the one that he came up with that everybody liked. But it was torturous. I mean, I wasn't on set for that, but I'd heard that they were really stymied because everyone, including Kirsch and Carey and Harrison, they just weren't satisfied with what the original line was. But what happens is whatever you ad lib, eventually they take it down like a stenographer and incorporate it in the published script. So it's
Thank God.
You'd never know that we added anything because it's all written down.
Well, same thing, same process with us when we were working on these Marvel films is people tend to improv on character but not on story. And ultimately we're telling a story. So you have to take what they're doing in character, get the best of it, figure out how it works for the story, rewrite it, then hand everybody back the script and go, okay, great, your improvs have been incorporated into the story now so that the story can still progress in the scene. Otherwise, the scene just becomes about behavior rather than story propulsion. So it was a process we learned having done a lot of comedy, is that ultimately you're going to have to take the nuggets and figure out how to incorporate them back into the script. And you brought up a great point about, you know, the 3-act structure of the 3 movies. The literal midpoint of this movie, I think, which we would probably identify as your phantom fight with Vader. And seeing your face in Vader's helmet, it's a thematic midpoint. It's an internal struggle that's being externalized. That is also the midpoint for the 3 films, because ultimately the films are driving towards this notion of whether you can be turned to the dark side or not by the Emperor and Vader. And that's ultimately the climax of Jedi. So Empire changed the notion of what commercial filmmaking could be, because commercial movies, traditionally, what is their defining characteristic is what you identified when you talked to George about your reaction to Return of the Jedi, is they end optimistically. That's why they're commercial, right? You get a wider audience because of that optimistic ending. But Empire defined what you could do with a film where you still had another movie to recover.
Did they know that? Or they just had the confidence to know that Star Wars was so successful, even if this is 30% less successful, we're definitely going to be able to do a third one. If I knew there was a third, I agree with you. But if I thought it could all go away, it's an even, frankly, ballsier choice if you didn't know there was a third one.
Did you guys know there was going to be a third one, Mark?
Well, the original deal was we signed for the first one, and based on the success of the first, whether we would do a 2 or a 3. So by the time we did Empire, the law of averages are it's going to make enough money that they're going to want to do a third. And I don't know if George got any pushback from the studio on how downbeat and dark it was, but he certainly had a lot more say in what we were doing than he did, I think, on the first one. And, it's one of those things, it's hard to believe now, but one of the things that he requested on the first film was merchandising rights. And they said, okay, fine. Like, they didn't see the potential. Now, I read this script and I said, oh my God, this is like a toy box. I've got a lightsaber. I've got a floating car. I've got these mechanical droids. I mean, I'm a Ray Harryhausen. I love the Universal horror films. This was right down my alley. I couldn't believe that I was in a movie that, as a kid, the movie that changed my life was the black and white King Kong. I saw it on the $1 Million Movie when we were living in New York, and it's epic. It made me cry. It was the first movie that made me cry my eyes out. I guess I was 5 or 6, and I was hoping somehow that they wouldn't bring Kong back to New York. I somehow hoped that he would escape his fate, but it got me every single time. So, I mean, by the time I was in the Rancor's hand, I had my Fay Ray moment. There's this big prop monster hand. There am I in the monster hand. See, I got excited about this sort of stuff. I was the one that would say, hey, you guys, look, my face is on the back of a cereal box. And Harrison's like, yeah, whatever. I mean, he couldn't care less. Carrie was more, she loved the tchotchkes, but I was the real enthusiast of the bunch. And this was a lonely experience, this movie, because I missed the camaraderie of being with Han and being with Leia. I started work first. We did the location stuff in Tunisia. Then we came to England, and then Harrison came over. And then finally, the final piece of the puzzle, Carrie comes over. And the first thing we shot was running up and down the hallways of the Death Star, having liberated her from her cell.
Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?
Huh? Oh, the uniform. I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
We liked each other. No one was trying to one-up themselves. We were just having a really good time. It was impossible not to have fun. We just laughed so hard. We had to do it sincerely when the cameras rolled, but it was just absurd. You'd be in the cockpit and you'd think to yourself, okay, to my right is one of the most venerated actors in the history of cinema, Sir Alec Guinness. To my left is a 7-foot guy in a furry monkey suit.
Joey, locking the auxiliary power.
What is wrong with this picture? So you'd have these moments of self-awareness that were hilarious.
I have a very bad feeling about this. Turn the ship around.
So we all got our own cars on the second one. I sort of regret that because on the first one, Harrison and I shared a car. So they picked me up and then we go pick up Harrison. And one morning he was trying to memorize, it'll take a few moments for the navigomputer to calculate the coordinates. It'll take a few moments for the navigomputer to calculate the coordinates.
That's when the fun begins. How long before you can make the jump to light speed? Take a few moments to get the coordinates from the navigomputer.
He was just doing this over and over and over. And of course, when push came to shove with squibs going off and them rocking the cockpit, he mangles the line, but in such a Han Solo way that that's the one that you remember.
Don't strap yourselves in. I'm going to make the jump to light speed.
I'd see these clips of us just goofing off like crazy because you get silly. You get a little punch drunk. You get goofy after being up there for 4 hours or whatever. They'd say, can you just stay when we reset the squibs? It'll save us a lot of time. Peter Mayhew has the Wookiee head off because they're only getting his shoulder. And Harrison and I are, he's in my hand and I'm doing Jerry Lewis takes. And Alec Guinness is just a model of professionalism. I look back now and I feel so embarrassed because he would not break. I mean, there's this one clip where Peter reaches his arm to do a control or something right in front of Guinness's face. And the eye roll, he's superb as a comedian.
Mark, did he have a sense of humor about it? Sir Alec Guinness?
He did. And one of the things I learned about him, because I was really uptight around him. I mean, it was like going to the principal's office. He asked me to go to lunch to get to know me before we started filming. And it took me a while, but I noticed that he had a great sense of humor. And I've got this sort of irreverent streak of humor in me. And one of the things I noticed was when I would make him laugh, which was great because it made me more comfortable. He enjoyed my irreverence, because, I mean, he comes from a different generation that has a different attitude. I kept calling him Sir Alec, Sir Alec, Sir Alec. And he reached out and he tapped me twice, and the third time went rather hard. And I went, ow. He said, I want to be known by my name, not my accolade. So immediately, without meaning a beat, I said, then can I call you Big Al? Now, see, he loved that. I asked him one time, why would you want to be in a movie like this? Because you'll notice we set the predicate for getting a really well-established, venerated actor, much like they picked Marlon Brando to play Kal-El's father when nobody knew who Christopher Reeve was. The only people in this movie that anybody had ever heard of were Peter Cushing and Alec Guinness.
And was that difficult for George to talk Alec into this, or no?
I didn't ask George specifically, but I did ask Alec one time. My mom was a huge fan of his, and my dad was in the military. We could see older movies at the movie theaters because they'd show Kind Hearts and Coronets, even though it was 20 years old or whatever.
One of the great performances in movie history, by the way, Kind Hearts and Coronets.
God, yeah. And it just goes on and on. The Lady Killers, the Lavender Hill Mob, and his range is astonishing. Bridge on the River Kwai. But in any case, I said to him, why would you want to be in this thing? Because most of the British crew, once I got to know them, like at dinner, they'd say, no, because between you and I, this is all a load of rubbish, isn't it? I go, what, this movie, a load of rubbish? They go, yeah, it's for kids, isn't it? It'll never play at nighttime. It'll be matinees only, right? We had great crew people. I mean, our cinematographer had shot Hard Day's Night. So we had top-level talent, but they didn't have anything to really compare it to. And to their eyes, it was just goofy nonsense for children. So I did ask Alec one time, why did you want to be in this movie? And he said, well, I always wanted to play a wizard in a children's film. So he was looking at it very much that way. When he met with George, he was really taken aback with how George's personality was so easygoing and no stress. He's not somebody that's going to raise his voice and scream and lose his temper. And I know that Alec really liked American Graffiti, even though it wasn't his kind of film. He appreciated what George was able to do with that material. So he had that confidence.
American Graffiti was another really important movie for us, and I think it was based on that character interaction, the reality of it. It was a movie about a night out and the way that people would interact with one another, but they were so true to life, the characters, and so real and familiar to you. They felt like your friends out having conversations. It's part of George's technique as a storyteller is to bring that sort of modern, familiar conversation quality, that level of realism to whatever it is he does. And he applied that to a space fantasy. And a lot of that interaction with Harrison and Chewbacca is reminiscent of like John Milner in American Graffiti. There's a quality there that just translates, and it made the trilogy so much more accessible and
relatable.
Relatable.
Yeah.
But it also was tongue-in-cheek without presenting itself in a way where it was degrading the genre. It was elevating it through naturalism.
Right. I remember my sisters asking my dad, can you drop us off a block from school? Basically because they didn't want their friends to see him in the piece of crap car that we had. So when I'm reading the script, and here we risk our lives, landing on the Death Star, finding the cell, blowing the door open, and rescuing this princess, the first thing she does when she looks at the Millennium Falcon,
There she is.
she goes, you came in that?
We're right above you. Stand by.
You came in that thing? You're braver than I thought.
Nice. Come on.
Now, that is so relatable. Forget that she's royalty and that she's spoiled beyond words. To me, those moments were just so golden and so right for the character. It was effortless. And
let me ask you this, Mark, in the spirit of like the rapport you're talking about with the other actors who sort of work in so many different ways. Some actors like a very controlled environment that is very well rehearsed, so everybody knows what they're doing and when. Other great actors like the opposite of that. They like things to be very improvisational and unpredictable and surprising to take. How do you like to work as an actor? And how did that sort of sync up with your co-actors and the rest of the ensemble?
I think it was all very natural. We were all very close to the characters we were playing. I was wide-eyed and enthusiastic. Carrie came from a background where her mother was a movie star, her father was a pop star. She was Hollywood royalty. Harrison, of course, had been a contract player at Columbia and was told by the head of casting, I got to be honest with you, you're never going to have a career. I mean, he really suffered through that last part of the contract system. So he was someone who really hit his stride in his mid-30s. He was mad that they didn't give him the part. He wanted the main part in Graffiti, but he appreciated the fact, because I said, oh, Bob Falfa is one of my favorite. You know, hey, kid, where'd you get the piece of shit?
Hey, you're supposed to be the fastest thing in the valley, man, but that can't be your car. It must be your mama's car. I'm sort of embarrassed to be this close to you.
It's so iconically Harrison. I know that he appreciated that I knew who he was. For the most part, we were moving so fast. You were trying to remember your lines, and when you walked it through for the crew, you were pretty much rehearsing on film. It wasn't like we were spending an hour and a half doing the scene over and over. I mean, I had time in the car with Harrison, and sometimes if Carrie, you know, she'd come into the makeup room and we'd run knowing that we're not going to have time on set. You had to grab the time for yourself. For the most part, Harrison was very hands-off. The one time I remember him saying, "Are you going to do it like that?" I said, well, what? When we were getting our medals. We were coming down steps or going, I think it was coming down steps, and we were synchronized. It was me and Harrison going, step, 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 step. Then I went, step, 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 step. And after that take, he said, "Are you going to do it like that?" I said, what? He goes, "Where you do the double time step." I said, "Well, Luke's enthusiastic. He's happy to be getting a medal." I tried to justify it, you know. We always called Harrison Dad, especially when we were doing press. We'd go on a TV show or we'd get interviewed by a magazine, and when it was over in the car, he'd say, "Mark, I liked when you said that you were not in it for the money. We're doing it because we like what we do. Carrie, you should leave out the story about Eddie being on drugs for his facelift," all that kind of stuff. So we get like a report card from Harrison.
Mark, things changed under Kirshner or in Empire in general. You undoubtedly had more days. You probably weren't in the go-go schedule that you were the first one.
Well, first of all, I was really upset that George wasn't going to direct it. I thought, why is he abandoning us? In retrospect, I realize now he was in the beginning stages. I mean, he'd become an entity, and he was setting up Industrial Light and Magic and dealing with the enormity of what Star Wars had wrought in the entertainment industry. But that sort of went away. I mean, I thought it indicated some sort of lack of faith that he wouldn't be around anymore, because we all adored George. I mean, he's not happy when he's making a movie. And we do a take, and, you know, they're coming in too fast. That's no moon. That's the space station. We do all the dialogue. And he wouldn't say cut or action. No one would hear him. He would tap Tony Way, the AD. He was from the Royal Air Force. "Turn over!" And then, of course, when George was wanting to stop, he tapped Tony again, and Tony would boom out, "Cut!" Because George would go, "Cut," and no one would hear him. Right away, we discovered that Kirshner was very much an actor's director. He did like talking about motivation and backstory and all the things that George didn't like. George really came alive in the cutting room. I remember going up when he was cutting Star Wars. He was like a completely different person, and he'd show me stuff, and he'd drive me down in his pickup to A&W Root Beer for a cheeseburger and a root beer float. And I mean, I tell employees of Lucasfilm these stories, and they're like, because they can't believe there was a time where he would jump in a pickup truck and drive anywhere. So I feel like I'm this old timer. Yeah, I remember the days before George was in limos. But Kirshner was sort of known for doing really interesting sequels to other films. He was much more into embracing the spirituality and talking about all those things that we weren't able to talk about before. And we had a little more leeway in terms of scheduling. When Luke goes off, he's pretty much leaving his friends behind, and it's good for the story. It's not as much fun, because if I wasn't working on second unit, I was constantly with the stunt guys. You know, I didn't have a stunt double in the first film, but then Colin Skeeping came in Empire because they wouldn't let me do the flip out the window. Although the stunt guy said, "Can you do a flip off the diving board because you're going to use a springboard?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, then you can do that." I said, "Oh boy," because up until that point, I'd done all my own stunts, but insurance wouldn't let me do it. It was like two separate films. I'd be walking either to a stunt rehearsal or to rehearsal with Frank Oz for Yoda, and I'd see Carrie and Harrison or Billy D walking in the other direction. Now they're on Cloud City, and I'm thinking, oh, it's sort of like the Death Star. They're all together in this antiseptic environment, and they're having fun that I'm not having. What happened was they wrapped everything. The only thing that was left to shoot was Luke and Yoda on Dagobah. Remember, I think the first film we shot in like 10 to 12 weeks. Empire wound up going 9 months. It still really sticks in George Craw that it went over budget. But it's understandable because by the time they wrapped everybody else, then it was just me on this. They built this soundstage just for Dagobah. And you look at the call sheet and it would say, actor Mark Hamill, part Luke Skywalker, and then everything else was props. Yoda was considered a prop. There were lizards, snakes, robots, and one human being. Now, Frank and Wendy and Kathy Mullen were doing Yoda, but they bury them in a trench below the soundstage. It was lonely, but I liked that. I was so thrilled to be finished with the sword fight because that was done over weeks and weeks on I don't know how many different sets. It was like the most physically challenging movie I've ever done. And Bob Anderson was doubling for Vader. Peter Diamond was the stunt coordinator. And to give you an example, we choreographed this one whole long sequence. And it's like dance. You have to do it over and over and over until it's ingrained in your sense memory where you're not thinking anymore. You're just doing it. George was there, not all the time, but he was sort of a presence. He came to look at what we had so far. So George looks at the whole thing and he said, the only problem is that lightsabers are really, really heavy, like Excalibur. So you can't take your hand off the handle ever. So if he had said that before we had done it, if there were moments where we spun around, I mean, you have a lot more flexibility if you don't have that rule that you have to have two hands on the hilt. Now, flash forward to when I saw the prequels, they're twirling these things around like batons. You know, so he evolved in his thinking, but at that time we had to go back to square one. I mean, they were basically using the same choreography of that sequence, but anytime I took my hand off or Vader took his hand off, we had to patch that up. But that meant like another 2.5 weeks. And like I say, if I had a day off, I wasn't able to go into the West End and go to bookstores and see a movie. I had to come to the studio and work all day with the stunt guys. And then if there wasn't stunt rehearsal, then Yoda stuff. One thing about these movies is because I was such an enthusiast, I was never in my dressing room. If I wasn't being used, I would love to go to Stuart Freeburn's Creature Shop or go to the weapons room or go to wardrobe or go watch them shoot. Some people don't like you being in their workspace, but John Mallow on wardrobe and Stuart were very welcoming. And, you know, I remember watching Stuart whip up the foam for one of the Yoda molds. And he said, "Do you want to pour it?" I said, "I'd love to." So he let me pour the foam into one of the Yodas. I mean, there were several, so I can't say it was the Yoda. I mean, there were some that were inarticulate. It was mostly for over the shoulder shots. To tell you the truth, when you see the movie, if I'm ever in close-up, I'm talking to a stick with a piece of tape on it.
I won't fail you. I'm not afraid.
Because he would inevitably break down and they'd rush him to Stuart's shop to try and fix him because the blinking eyes, the eyes going side to side, the eyelids, the ears moving.
You must feel the force around you. Here, between you, me, the tree, the rock.
Something would always break, and then it was constantly under maintenance.
Constantly under maintenance. So a lot of times, if it's over the shoulder, they might move his head a little bit. If it's over Yoda onto Luke, they would move him a bit, but it was the blank one. But that wasn't as hard as people think, you know, because when you rehearse it enough, you know what it's going to look like. You remember what Frank did when he was fully articulating it. And it's the same as in the cockpit. They say, "Isn't that really strange that you're flying a spaceship? It's not something you can draw from in life." And I said, well, you know, I mean, it's no different than when you're driving a car in a movie and you're in a cutaway automobile and they're putting the lights past your face and they're rocking it slowly. It's just a different vehicle. Even though we laughed a lot and knew how absurd it was on its face, we really had to commit to it in a way. That's what was so great about the Han Solo character, too, was that he was the skeptic for the audience. When it got too corny, hey kid, hokey religions. I mean, I'm like, golly, you don't believe in the Force. I was like painfully sincere, and for people in the audience that were thinking this is kind of baby stuff, you had Han Solo to mock it openly for them.
Another construct of George's, I mean, if you look at his work, there's an intense wit to everything he does. And again, it translates from American Graffiti to the Star Wars films, that wit, or characters who are self-aware of the situations and are very cerebral or have a perspective on them that are self-aware. You mentioned earlier that Empire is a famously darker second act of a trilogy. It's shot darker. The third act is basically German expressionism with those forced perspectives during the fight. You guys are backlit constantly.
The Force is with you, young Skywalker.
Very moody third act. Characters feel a little grittier and tougher. There's more close-ups. Kirshner was a big fan of the human face. Did you feel that when you were shooting it? Could you tell while he was executing it that it was just going to, in general, feel darker? You'd mentioned this, that Star Wars, you said, felt more like a ride to you, and this is a different exploration.
Yeah, with Star Wars, you didn't really have to do anything. You just had to sit down and open your eyes. This one required more from the audience in terms of suspension of disbelief and challenging in its concepts and its ideas. But it was of a whole. You asked the question, did I realize that Kirshner and Shusitsky were doing these specific things for this film? It was all organic in a way, because what I was going through was what Luke was going through. In other words, he was no longer this clueless farm boy. I mean, he had matured to a point where he was on his journey, and that was all part of the process of telling that story. So
you start the film in a different place. I mean, Luke is attacked at the start of the movie. There's a close-up of you at the beginning of the film. You kind of dust off the snow off your watch, and then wham! He almost freezes to death. Han Solo has to come get him. It's a very interesting way to start a story about a hero. It seemed to even start in a darker place. Traditionally, you'd have sort of a status quo. You get the audience involved in a way where they're entertained, and then you'd start hitting them with conflict.
It's like foreshadowing and telling the audience this isn't the movie that you were expecting. It's interesting because, Harrison wasn't meant to go to Norway at all. We were going to do that on false snow. They did a recce out to a glacier about 90 minutes from, we were staying in basically a ski lodge. And there was a glacier that photographed blue. On film, it looked blue. Not only were Kirsch and Shusitsky excited about that, the whole crew was anxious to go and see what that looked like. And I think they eventually got a plate of it. It might be in the film somewhere, but my point is, as you know, in filmmaking, the worst possible thing happened, which was it was like one of the coldest winters ever, in, I don't know, 20, 30 years. My point is there was a blizzard. We couldn't get to that location. That's where they were going to do the rescue of Luke when Han comes and finds him with his dead Tauntaun. Instead, we shot it maybe 100 yards from the ski lodge. I mean, if you turn the cameras around from when I was being rescued, you see all these people on their balconies sipping cocoa, watching a shoot.
This may smell bad, kid. But it'll keep you warm.
One time we were far away from the lodge, and this helicopter buzzed the set. And we went, oh my gosh, it's the paparazzi grabbing photographs. And it turns out they bribed this helicopter pilot who was meant to be patrolling for skiers that got into distress or needed help to buzz our set and take photographs. And what I loved was that it showed up in one of the tabloids and it said, strange alien vehicles dominate the terrain in Star Wars 2, right? They didn't know the title yet. And it was all pictures of snowmobiles with the company name clearly in view. I mean, they didn't get anything. I'm sure we would have been really upset if they got a shot of the Tauntaun or something that would be a giveaway, but they just got snowmobiles and whatever. And that reminds me, another false leak they got was in the script, Vader never says, no, I am your father. At that point, the line is, you don't know the truth Obi-Wan killed your father. Now, when I read that, I went, holy moly, Alec Guinness is the bad guy. That's a hell of a twist in and of itself. So Kirshner brought me aside and he said, look, I'm going to tell you, that's not going to be in the script. But I'm going to tell you something now. George knows, I know, and when I tell you, you'll know. So if it leaks, we'll know it came from you. Then he showed me the line written down, no, I am your father. And I go, oh my God, is that true? And he goes, well, we're going to play it exactly like it is in the script. I say, no, that's not true. That's impossible. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. So yeah, you know, whether it turns out to be true or not, Luke in the moment believes that is true. So, okay, we're shooting that scene. Now there's wind machines. You know, I can't hear. First of all, Vader's completely muffled. And there's those gigantic wind machines. You couldn't hear anything. I had to usually go by his gestures. Same with Yoda. I mean, there's so many times where I was picking up radio signals in my earpiece. You know, I pick up pop music. I remember the Rolling Stones' "Fool to Cry." Many years have I. Ooh, Daddy, you're a fool to cry. And I laughed. And Kurt said, what's the matter? I said, I'm picking up the Stones. He said, look, that happens again. Don't break. Just keep going. But what I would do is no matter what happened in my earpiece, I would go by with his lips stop moving. Then I do my next line because we didn't have time to waste by laughing. And we shoot the scene. Now, there's lots of extras playing, or they call them background artists, which is so much nicer in England. Apparently, there were reporters in the pubs offering 20, 40, 50 pounds for any Star Wars stuff. So if we shot that on a Tuesday, by Thursday, in a little box on the front page of a tabloid, it says, Guinness head baddie in Star Wars 2. Now, I was delighted because I knew that was wrong. But everybody else, Carrie and Harrison, said, son of a bitch, they've ruined that great surprise. That was very difficult to keep that secret that long.
This was the era of subterfuge in filmmaking started many years ago.
Much more intense now with social media and people having cameras on set and being able to send something that goes around the world in a second. This was pretty innocent times compared to now.
Mark, was there a scene in the movie that you found tricky to access as an actor or find your way into or find your way through, or did it all just come to you?
Well, I mean, there were scenes that reference where I have the vision of defeating Vader and cutting off his head and seeing my own face, which I loved. It was atypical for a Star Wars film because it was more European in letting the audience interpret what that meant, really. I loved that. It was funny because they made a mold in my face. They didn't like the way that looked. So we went back another day and they cut a hole in the floor of the set on a rostrum and I got underneath and stuck my head up through the helmet. So that's my real face. Hard to keep your eyes open when they're wafting smoke over your eyes. But in terms of finding a scene that was difficult to get right, all of it to me. I mean, you're always wondering if you can't do something better. I mean, one of the disadvantages I'm having today is I haven't seen this movie since they re-released it in 97. George's secretary called me and said, George is going to do the special edition where he tweaks the special effects. I said, oh, great, send me a copy. I had no intention of going to see him, but my kids, they're all grown now. But at that time in 97, they were all still living at home. And they said, what? We're not going to go see it at the movies? I said, you guys have seen it countless times over and over on, I think it was VHS then. It wasn't even DVDs. They said, yeah, but we've never seen it on the big screen. I thought, you know what? They're right. There's nothing, as you know, like seeing it at its full potential, perfect sound, perfect projection, perfect everything. As they each came out, we went to Star Wars, we went to Empire, we went to Jedi. I saw them all, and I haven't seen them again since. I noticed you mentioned that you watched it in preparation for today. Mm-hmm. That's something I should have done, but I don't enjoy watching myself. You know what you're talking about is something that it will always be hard for me because you always see the flaws. You always think, oh, I wish I'd done this. I wish I hadn't done that. Oh, that's a moment that I understand so much better now that it's an exercise in futility. You can't go back. It's done. And you have to let it go.
Mark, thank you so much for your openness and your candor and your time. We've gotten so much out of it. This is going to be the conclusion of part 1 of our conversation. And I cannot wait for part 2 coming soon.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Signing out.